What I'm really concerned about is the fact that within universities, a very illiberal ethos has become institutionalized, where for the first time, a growing number of young people actually think that freedom is not a big deal.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV. Today we are talking with Frank Ferretti. He's an emeritus professor at the University of Kent, a sociologist, and the author of most recently, What's Happened to the University, a sociological exploration of its infantilization. Frank, thanks for talking to us.
Pleasure.
Okay, so what is so bad about the university right now? What's the thesis of the book?
I think what the book suggests is that there was a time when universities were a place where you could spontaneously interact, where free speech, academic freedom were really valued. It was a place of experimentation and risk-taking, where you could really go to the edge of the world, look over the cliff, and just basically make things happen. Whereas today, what has happened is that, in many respects, the university has become far more sort of conservative, far more restrictive, far more inward-looking, and very, very liberal. So in many respects, it's easier to speak about controversial subjects outside of the university than inside the university. It's a historical role reversal where the university has become far more censorious than the rest of society, and that's something I find very troubling.
Is the entire university being infantilized, or is it students, and what are the causes of that?
Well, what I mean by infantilization is a situation where the line that used to exist between high school and university has become eroded, where young men and young women coming to university regard themselves and are treated as if they were biologically mature children, where there's a powerful impulse towards paternalism, where you look after 18, 19, 21-year-olds instead of allowing them to make their way in the world. And the whole of the whole of the teaching profession has almost reorganized its pedagogy around the assumption that essentially you're dealing with clever children rather than with independently minded young men and young women. And I think that's what I mean by infantilization.
What are the causes driving that? Because it's so 18-year-olds, when they show up, or 17, 18, 19-year-olds, they're no longer treated as adults. They're still treated as children. Why is that?
Well, what I argue is that in many respects, where the problem really lies is in the failure of adult society to socialize young people, to educate them for freedom and independence, where historically in America or in England, young people were socialized into values about what is right and what is wrong, the importance of freedom, of self-reliance, of responsibility, a whole set of values. And even if the kids didn't really live up to it, they knew that these were aspirationally quite important. And as a result of that, when you're 14 or 15 or 16, you were dying to become a grown-up. You kind of pretended to be a young man or a young woman. Whereas today, I think what we've done is, instead of socializing people into values, we rely on psychological techniques as a substitute.
So what does that mean? Yeah.
That means, for example, that parents also are told not to criticize their children, but instead to smile at them. So when kids do something wrong, you don't say you've been a bad person, but this is a bad sort of act that was carried out. You kind of turn into a psychologist, as a mother or a father, and you regard your child as a patient, because the conviction is that children are so powerless and fragile that unless you emotionally support them, raise their self-esteem, they're going to have long-term damage to their self-esteem and to their psyche. And what's even worse is that the schools carry on doing that. And if you look at the system of education that has evolved, it's got a pedagogy that's really about, sort of validating them, making them feel good about themselves, very rarely criticizing them, minimizing the pressure that they're under, making sure they're not too competitive against each other. And as a result of that, what happens is that the kids are quarantined from the pressures of everyday life.
Is that true at all levels of class, or are we talking, first off, universities, I mean, about 2/3 or a little bit more than 2/3 of high school students in America go on to some form of college immediately. I suspect it's about the same, or maybe a little bit lower in England. But is this in all classes, or is this really, are we talking about rich people who are afraid that their kids can't make the grade, so they want to get rid of those kinds of judgments?
Well, as you're suggesting, a lot of these customs begin in the more sort of wealthy, affluent areas of society. They're the ones that innovated the ideas of new forms of sensitivity training, of bringing in emotional literacy. So it's really a set of practices that begins amongst a small section of society. But over 25, 30 years, it gradually filters down. So that in more recent decades, particularly since the turn of the 21st century, even people coming from less wealthy backgrounds become influenced by this. And parents who come from working class backgrounds begin to internalize or are under pressure to internalize these forms of behavior. If you look at a typical parenting class that is given to working class or very poor people, the workshops for parents are all about making them into amateur therapists who are going to then sort of make sure that the emotions.
So, you're calling for parents to hit their children? That's what I'm hearing, or to be hard, to be harsh on them, and things like that.
What I'm arguing for is that bringing kids up is a relationship. It's a relationship between a mother and a father and a child. You're going to make a lot of mistakes in the course of bringing your kids up, and you're going to learn from those mistakes. And the child will also learn that moms and dads do things that are unexpected or wrong. But in the course of doing that, the child becomes stronger. And I think your job as a parent is to encourage their independence, to provide them with the support they need to stand on their 2 feet, to make the judgment calls, where occasionally you allow them to take risks, even though you know that it's possible that they may graze their knees and they might get into trouble. But instead of immunizing them from the pressures of everyday life, your job is to actually make sure that they become strong as soon as possible.
So, in a kind of contemporary American debate, a lot of the times, college is treated as that's a stage that people come to, and whatever is happening there is because of what's happening on the campus. You're essentially arguing that if you're focusing on college, you're missing where all of this stuff is actually coming from. So you could be treating the symptom, but not the cause.
That's right. So at the same time, although, as I argue, almost all the developments to do with people's sort of physical and moral behavior occurs a long time before they go to university. Nevertheless, the universities are really important indirectly, because we have to remember that universities now are a massive institution. For example, the universities influence the values of the teaching profession. So all the schools are inhabited by people who've gone to university themselves, who've internalized the kind of values and practices that are popular in universities. They also influence a very large section of society who are parents, because a lot of parents, a growing number of parents, have gone to college themselves. So indirectly, the values that are created and constructed within the university environment are, I would argue, the most powerful drivers of socialization.
Are they? Is there an ideological basis in that, or is this kind of a blind procession of, well, the people at university or in education schools or in psychology, they just think they're doing things right, or is it that they have a particular ideology that they're trying to impart?
Well, I suppose you could say there's an ideological element, as long as we see ideology with a small I. In other words, it's not a political ideology that's being promoted, but, for example, a lot of the teaching profession or the people getting involved in social work learn very, very fast that their job is really to save children from their parents, that their job is to make sure that these fairly thick, stupid parents who are completely insensitive to the needs of their child somehow get the skills from them that's necessary to bring those kinds of kids up. So there's a kind of mission there that's promoted. So the vocation of teaching and social work and other helping professions do have an ideological underpinning, but it's not a left wing or a right wing or a liberal ideology. It's simply a particular orientation towards the human self.
Where do we see the negative effects? I mean, you say, okay, but let's grant that children and young adults or society is becoming more infantilized. Actual adults, 20 people in their 20s are being treated like children. What's the harm in that? In the sense of, crime in most places is down. People live longer. They seem to be about as happy as they've ever been. Is there something wrong with that?
Well, not necessarily, because I know in my case, myself and all my friends did everything possible to delay growing up and having fun. And Nobody wanted to turn into a gray-suited, sort of office worker at the age of 21. You wanted to explore the world and you wanted to make things happen. So all those aspirations are entirely positive. I'm not really against that. But what I'm talking about is something a little bit different. It's not about an aspiration to experiment, to take risks, and to avoid responsibility in order to do something transformative or interesting. It's basically an avoidance of growing up in order to stay still and to avoid the pressures that come with becoming an older person. And I think that where you can see the downside of this are developments like the fact that in the Western world, people living at home are the fastest growing demographic group. You have situations in Japan where leaving home is seen as almost an impossible ask for many young people. I've done interviews with young men and young women in England who are late 20s, early 30s, come from very relatively affluent backgrounds. And when I ask them, why are you living with mom and dad? They say, well, it's very comfortable. She cooks stuff for me. And then when I ask them, well, what do you do with your girlfriends or your boyfriends? It's not a problem. I can bring them home. And I said, well, is that the high point of your ambition, that your girlfriend and you're upstairs in the bedroom while mom and dad are watching television? Sort of. I think it's a bizarre development.
Well, okay, then let me ask you, in the book you talk about coming of age in the universities in the 60s and the 70s, and you talk about the activism then. But are you just trying to replicate your experience as a child? And you're now at an age where, are you just nostalgic for your past and you want the world to be the way it was when you were growing up?
Well, there's always a danger that we become caricatures of ourselves and merely sort of want to rediscover the past in the future. And I really hope that's not what I'm doing, because as a sociologist, I know that history never repeats itself, and experiences and cultural norms always mutate and change. So it's impossible to imagine that the 1960s are going to come back, 10 or 20 years down the road. But what I'm really concerned about is not to rediscover my generation. What I'm really concerned about is the fact that within universities, a very illiberal ethos has become institutionalized, where for the first time, since the modern era, a growing number of young people actually think that freedom is not a big deal, and they are quite, sort of upfront about it. They are in your face when they say, "Well, what's the big deal about freedom or free speech? Why are you going about academic freedom? So what? So what if we censor somebody from saying something that's offensive? So what if a certain academic is forced to watch their word?" That's a small price to pay for us being comfortable. And when you have that kind of acceptance of this kind of semi-totalitarian impulse towards closing discussion down, that is really worrying for me.
Particularly at the university, as you were saying, because that's the one place you could see that in a workplace maybe, but the whole idea of the university is that that's where that happens.
That's right. And it's interesting how powerful it is. A friend of mine who's Hungarian was invited to go to Florida to give lectures on the Hungarian Holocaust. And he's totally unaware of what goes on in universities. And he's showing a picture of Auschwitz. And basically, the picture shows a woman before she got to Auschwitz, a beautiful Jewish woman in 1939. And then shows a picture of the same woman, sort of skin and bones, after Auschwitz, but looking almost like a corpse. And this woman in the auditorium cries out, "Stop it, stop it. I came here to hear a lecture on the Holocaust." And I'm offended and everything else. So my friend just looks at her and says, "Well, actually, this is a lecture on the Holocaust. And, what did you expect? Sort of a Disney representation of a fairy tale." And he thought that was the end of the matter.
Yeah.
A day later, he gets called in by the dean and says, "This is not how we do things in our university." And he gets basically reprimanded for discussing a disturbing theme.
Right.
And if we come to that point where you can't even discuss the Holocaust as a Holocaust, but you got to have a Disneyfied version of it, then we are in big trouble.
You've identified the problem. You've discussed some of the root causes and the development over time and the effects of it. What are the means of redress? What can we do to kind of force the universities and society to become more mature?
Well, I think that's a really big problem, because there isn't a simple answer for that. I think Universities need to take ideas a little bit more seriously, because if you take ideas seriously, for example, if you think that freedom is actually a big deal, then you're far less likely to accommodate to censorious trends. You're going to stand up and be counted. We have to really go out of our way to popularize the importance of many of the elementary liberal norms, tolerance and freedom, democracy, which have become emptied of meaning at the moment. We got to find a way of making it sound very 21st century. We have to particularly direct our attention towards young people. One of the things I've been doing in Europe is going around and talking to high school students. And I know it sounds weird being a university professor, but I find it very interesting talking to 17, 18-year-olds before they go to university, because at that point they're still idealistic. They kind of feel that they can make things happen. They haven't been kind of ground down by the university ethos that they're going to go into. And if you can somehow capture their imagination, inspire them by indicating there's a different way of looking at the world, then you can at least build up a larger cohort of more freedom-loving, more freedom-interested individuals. And there's a lot of kids like that, who are, have got a lot of energy within them, and they are looking to be inspired. And very often when they go to university, they will tell you that they're being validated, and everybody flatters them, and everybody tells them how wonderful they are. But it's very rare when they get really stretched and they really feel that something positive has occurred. So I think all those things are really important. But I think above all, I think what we need to do is to challenge the child-rearing, socializing culture in a more systematic way. I think at the moment people are very, 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 very scared to actually make the point that children, are quite capable of agency. They're quite capable of standing on their 2 feet. We can treat them as potential adults already at a very early age, and there's no reason why their capacity for independence should not be cultivated, not when they're 45, but when they are 6.
Well, we will leave it there. We have been talking with Frank Ferretti. He's a sociologist at the University of Kent, and he's the author most recently of What's Happened to the University, a sociological exploration of its infantilization. Frank, thanks for talking to us. For Reason, I'm Nick Gillespie.